Awesome, great. Well, I'm very excited to be here speaking today. I hope you guys are excited as well, as it's 3:30 Eastern time here, and it may be a different time depending on your time zone. But I wanted to share this session on to speak about continuous efficiency for every pipeline. So really the purpose of this talk is to encourage discussions around bringing observability concepts into our software delivery processes. And you can see that this is a pretty uniting theme throughout the whole conference is observability, and then also getting to production and really hardening our applications. And so there you go. And so there's three parts to this talk. We're going to talk about software delivery, kind of defined it. What are the phases of it? Then we're going to discuss observability for verifying our deployments and getting to production. And also scaling and really sustaining effective and efficient software delivery pipelines. And at the end, we'll have a QA session, so feel free to save your questions or ask them along the way, and we'll address those towards the end. A little bit about me. My name is Tiffany Jachja. I'm a technical evangelist at Harness, and I'm very passionate about sharing and creating content around software delivery. And so I'm really excited about this talk because it bundles in a lot of my experiences and things I'm excited about. Prior to joining Harness earlier this year, I was a consultant at Red Hat, and I had a lot of opportunities and exposure to open source solutions and observability for enterprises hoping to kind of work on their applications and deliver them to the cloud. So let's just get started on the talk. Software delivery is about delivering your packaged code to an end customer. So traditional SDLC, traditional software delivery development life cycles include building your code, testing it, and then deploying it, right? And the reason why I included this picture here of the DevOps loop is because we really need to think about how we're operationalizing and monitoring our applications so that it informs our next deployment, or rather our next iteration of work. So it's not just about how you plan and build and test your code and also deploy it, but it's also about monitoring and operationalizing it in an automated fashion so that you can truly reduce risk the next time you're going to deploy. And to do software delivery in a consistent and automated way, we have software delivery pipelines, and this can look like this can be code, this can be automation, this can be provided through a service, but basically it gets your package code from point A to B. And you may have different ways of getting to production. It may include change management. It may include releasing to a specific environment first and doing specific types of testing, right? But pipelines are an automation to capture some of those workflows. And you can stitch together these steps to build a pipeline that you can give to developers to basically ship code. And so this is a sustainable way. Oh, well, it can be a sustainable way if you do it the right way. And so this is what a typical deployment pipeline looks like. You'll provision environments for your application to live in. You'll deploy that packaged artifact to a QA environment, a quality assurance environment, and then you'll do that QA process and that testing to ensure that it looks good. If it does, then you may get some approval, and then you can deploy that artifact to a production environment. And after you deploy that artifact and it's living on a production environment, you typically verify the health of that application through your observability tools, through your metrics, through your traces, right? And then roll back if there's any issues. And so that's typically a deployment pipeline. And a lot of times, pipelines won't include the last 5 and 6 steps, right? And so that's the focus of this talk, is how do we want to verify the health of our applications so that we can verify that our deployments are working soundly. And the lack of automation around verifying deployments, as we've heard in the keynote, is actually it's actually very uncommon, and it's actually something that's not this lack of automation is actually pretty uncommon. They were doing surveys across a bunch of organizations, and they found that about 6% of organizations reported 90 to 100% automation of their whole entire pipeline, a software delivery operations pipeline. So hopefully this talk will give you some idea about what it means to sort of take your observability concepts and bring them into your pipeline. The reality of it is that we're having complex environments, right? We have many teams producing their own services and taking in tools that work for their specific environments. It's not that uncommon to have one team have a Prometheus instance and an APM solution like Datadog or App Dynamics, and then another team also have Prometheus and something else, depending on their environment. And so the goal is to be able to really, despite the fact that you have different tools, still be able to track and verify your deployments through your pipelines. And really, this is a great way to sustain scaling, right? Because as we build out more microservices, as we introduce and onboard more teams, manually depending on our observability tools doesn't really scale, and it hurts. And so that's the continuous verification aspect of this talk. It's really considering our observability tools so that we can define roles in our pipeline so that we can take action when there are regressions in our code. And so to understand the continuous verification aspect to this, we do need to understand verification and observability is primarily how we verify our deployments. And so we've talked about this a lot today. The three components of observability include logs, metrics, and traces. And so for your logs, those are primarily events. So you can have success events, warnings, show-stopping events, failures. Typically for events, you just want them to be in a consistent format that's usable for you so that when there is an issue in your production deployment or your QA deployment, you know exactly how to analyze that and take action. Something that's being more standard, that's becoming more standard thanks to the OpenTelemetry project, are metrics and traces. Metrics are to be aggregated, and they basically give you a good idea about what's happening in your in your application or in your system. They're fairly straightforward. Specific systems will expose certain types of metrics. So like your Kubernetes cluster may expose information about how many pods you have running and how many namespaces and that kind of stuff. You can also create your own custom metrics that work for your applications, your specific services that you've implemented. And then finally, your traces. Those are requests scoped, so they're in the view of a request. And really, they help you determine when a request fails, what in the call chain, which service in the call chain failed, and what was the context that was passed around that kind of helps you see what went wrong. And so really when you want to introduce the idea of observability for verification, you want to include service or app level details, not just system details, but really what's going on in your application. And so I included a couple of metrics and trace information that you want to capture within your software delivery process or your pipeline. And that's primarily through average response times and calls per minute for your metrics. And then you also want to track your latency and then any failing or service requests through your tracing solution. And so really these 4 components is a good start for you to be able to capture abnormal behavior in your applications so that you can be alerted and then you can also take predefined action in your pipelines. And so continuous verification is being able to look at these observability concepts, or these, you can take the visibility that you've exposed through observability, and then also use that to define the rules that you want to have in case that you have regressions and you need to trigger a rollback for your deployment, or you need to do something specific. And so the way that this really comes together is through OpenTelemetry, which was a project, open source project that was announced last year. It beta released last week. And they include certain components to help kind of standardize this across organizations. And the nice thing about OpenTelemetry is that it's not only a unified approach to observability, it's also a call to different services and organizations and applications to really see how they can bring in observability concepts into their processes. So I really hope that this encourages organizations to start doing this. I know that it would make a huge difference, at least in the continuous delivery space or software delivery space, if we were to be able to really expose certain information about our pipelines and deployments. And so this was just, so continuous delivery was just one example of how to integrate observability into pipelines and software delivery itself, which I think is something that we really need to push, because it's something that can really be great for anyone with a software delivery stake. And so that's the ethos to this last part of my talk, around sustaining and building efficient pipelines that can work across organizations, right? Because as we know, observability is not just for ops. It's not just ops responsibility or ops problem. It's something that everybody can, observability is something that can give everybody a chance to optimize their software delivery processes and really make a difference when we're deploying and serving customers. Many times you'll see one or two developers 2 or 3 days after a deployment looking at dashboards and showing everything's okay, but we know that this isn't very sustainable, and it isn't practical either, because everybody should have a role in software delivery. And so I wanted to share two recommendations around building and sustaining pipelines. So that you can scale your organization and your software delivery. And so this first recommendation is around tracking your key deployment metrics. And these 4 metrics are from the Accelerate book, which features the Dora work that Nicole did, and this book was also co-written by Jean Kim. It includes 4 key metrics that you should have around your deployments. So deployment frequency, lead time for changes, mean time to recover, and change failure rate. And really, if you can track these things based off of your deployments and your history, if you can even get a dashboard on this, it's really setting you on a good trajectory for being able to optimize your software delivery pipelines. Because, for example, if you have a poor change failure rate, it could be an indication that you don't have enough integration tests or code quality gates, right? And you could also see that if you have a poor change failure rate and a poor deployment frequency, that could, or infrequent deployment frequency, that could mean that you're trying to do very large releases and that you should maybe deploy more often and in smaller increments so that you can make those wins in a sustainable way. And obviously, this also introduces ways for you to bring in your own practices. So around DevOps, especially if you wanted to hold a team retro or some type of metrics-based process mapping, some type of process mapping around what you're doing to optimize these things, you can really do your own due diligence and analysis on, why you're not reaching the outcomes that you're trying to reach. And so I also have a QR code here, and it links to a blog post that talks about how someone at their company used these 4 metrics to and they exposed them for their pipelines in AWS code pipelines, and so they shared sort of their findings and how they did it. So it's just one use case of how someone did it. People harness do it too. We have a dashboard, but there are many ways to do it. It's just a great start for you to be able to kind of optimize in certain areas so that your pipelines are effective and that you are getting the most out of them when you do set up and use your pipelines and give them to developers. So the last part of my last recommendation is around sharing responsibility around around costs specifically. So consider being able to expose visibility into cloud costs, and primarily. And so this graphic is a survey that they did on a State of the Cloud report did on how companies were optimizing cloud costs. And primarily it was through visibility. So being able to share responsibility on idle dev environments, on services that are over allocated in both CPU and memory, in the cost in versions changing. Maybe every time you release a new version, you're using more memory or using more CPU, and being able to track those things so that they're not out of mind and they are on the radar of your team can really help you optimize on your next iteration of work. And really also sustain pipelines, because if you want to, if you've started on your DevOps journey and you're creating your CI/CD processes, your continuous integration, continuous delivery processes, then you want to be able to scale them and not have it be costly. And so that's really the component. That's really the ethos around this last part of this talk around continuous efficiency, which is being able to continuously share these metrics so that we can continue to optimize and really drive software delivery for everybody. So that's pretty much my talk. There's a QR code for the slide deck if you're interested. I have a couple of speakers' notes in there too. I really appreciate everybody attending this session. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll be around. Thank you so much.